Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. And today we have Nico Sturm, the first player on this review list who was not with the San Jose Sharks this past season. We've already discussed Logan Couture, who of course has been here for many, many years. Erik Karlsson has been here for at least a few years, but Nico Sturm was not with the Sharks this past year and was instead brought in as a free agent signing by Mike Grier. And originally, I wasn't a huge fan of this free agent signing him for 3 years for a fourth line player already seems like a bit much, and the fact that he ends up making about $2 million per year seemed like it could end up being a bad thing considering the role that he played last year with a combination of the Minnesota Wild and the Avalanche. You see, when he was with the Wild, he's on a league minimum contract, and while he is playing in many of those Minnesota games and putting up some decent points, he wasn't necessarily playing a huge role. He would eventually get traded to the Avalanche, like I said, in exchange for Tyson Jost, and the major reason for that trade was that Jost kind of overstayed his welcome a bit, I guess you could say, in Colorado, was moving down the depth charts as certain other players were passing him, and the Avalanche would rather have a player like Nico Sturm in that bottom six compared to Tyson Jost, who would be given a better opportunity in Minnesota, and so they pick up Nico Sturm. But it's not as though Sturm was playing a huge role with the Avalanche, would play many of their last few games to end off the season, only put up about 3 assists during those 21 games, and then in the playoffs would end up having the lowest ice time out of any Avalanche player who got any sort of playoff time during their Stanley Cup run, with just under 8.5 minutes of time on ice. So yes, he was part of that Stanley Cup winning team. You could say he has that Stanley Cup pedigree, but realistically, he was the least important part of that formula. And so to say that the Sharks were bringing him in because he knew how to win or anything like that seemed to be a bit of a stretch. And paying $2 million for a player who couldn't even play in every single playoff game for the Avalanche seemed like a lot. But here's the real situation. The Avalanche were an extremely good team. And so if Nico Sturm's level was around here, there were a good 12 forwards or so who were above that level on the Avalanche. McKinnon, Rantanen, Landeskog, all of these players much better than Nico Sturm. But the fact is that the Sharks are not nearly as good as the Avalanche were in that playoff run for the Stanley Cup. The Sharks are significantly worse, in fact. And so while there are definitely a few players above Nico Sturm's, let's say, assumed stayed at level, like Couture, Barabanov, and Hertl, there are also multiple players who the Sharks would ice this season, like Svechnikov or Lorentz or Lindblom, who are below that line of Nico Sturm. And so while he was a borderline fourth liner on the Avalanche Stanley Cup winning team, he's more like a third liner on the very bad San Jose Sharks. And so he ends up actually playing that expanded role and doing it rather admirably. At the start of this season, he played in that fourth line role and was very good at that, but because there are not a lot of other better options on the Sharks roster, he got boosted up to the third line. And while he did struggle at times in this particular role, I'd say he did an all-around decent job and certainly worth the $2 million that the Sharks paid him. One of the biggest issues that Nico Sturm had this season was that, like many of the other Sharks players, he never really got to lock down any consistent line mates. I talked about this as well with Logan Couture in my previous review, but at least with Couture, he had sort of semi-consistent line mates of Matt Nieto and Barabanov, who were with him for about a quarter of his even-strength ice time this season. When it comes to Nico Sturm, his most common line mates were Evgeny Svechnikov and Noah Gregor, and yet even those two only played about 10% of Nico Sturm's even-strength ice time this season. Otherwise, he was constantly having a carousel of wingers next to him, meaning he never really got to lock down any sort of chemistry with the players. One day he would have Svechnikov and Gregor, the next day he'd have Nick Bonino and Andrew Cogliano, and then the next day he'd have Matt Nieto and Kevin Labanc, and then the next day he'd have, you get the idea there, as it was just constantly shifting. And yet Sturm still did an admirable job. The fact was that the Sharks had a pretty much locked down center core of Hertl, Couture, and Sturm down the middle for those top 3 lines, and the wingers were just basically trying to, whoever was better on that particular day would get higher up lineup spots, and whoever was worse would get lower down, with not really much consideration paid to anything else. Going on to his actual statistics on the year, he played about 74 games. There wasn't any healthy scratches this season, just a few minor injuries here or there. 14 goals, 12 assists for 26 points. So while 26 points isn't necessarily amazingly impressive for a third line player, it would be very good for a fourth liner, but for a third liner, it's pretty decent. I would say that his 14 goals do stand out in a very positive light. 14 goals from your third line center is actually quite good, though it should be noted that many of those goals were concentrated in the early parts of this past season. In fact, during the early parts of this season for the San Jose Sharks, they were extremely bad. It's hard to imagine that they could have been any worse than they were from the majority of the season, but those first few games were especially bad from a Sharks perspective, and Nico Sturm was one of their only players who was actually managing to produce, had 5 goals through the first 11 games, which is technically a 35 to 40 goal pace, but it was obviously never going to sustain itself, and he would end up with a still solid 14, and like I said, those 26 points. If we take a look at the plus minus, obviously it is a pretty sizable minus, as you would expect from most of the players on the Sharks roster, because the Sharks were just generally a bad team, so they're going to get outscored at even strength. It should be noted that obviously this is much better looking than Karlsson's plus minus or Logan Couture's plus minus, but like I mentioned in both of those videos, compared to Nico Sturm is not on the ice for any empty net type of situation. So instead of Couture and Karlsson, who both got essentially a free minus 21, Nico Sturm did not get that, and so his minus was slightly less inflated. However, it should still be noted that Nico Sturm is a solid defensive forward, or at least solid enough from a Sharks perspective. I also talked about when I was mentioning Logan Couture that in comparison to Tomas Hertl, Couture took significantly more defensive zone draws, 24% for Hertl, 42% for Logan Couture, while Nico Sturm took over half of his face-offs in the defensive zone. So even though Couture was likely used in most of the clutch type of we really need to not let in a goal type of situations here, it was pretty often that if a face-off was in the defensive zone, David Quinn was going to be sending over Nico Sturm because he didn't really have much of a reason to play him in the offensive zone. So this is obviously going to hurt his plus-minus in some ways. One of the other things is that Nico Sturm frequently was on a line that had issues clearing the puck out of its own zone, while he was doing an okay job at preventing goals against for himself. He wasn't necessarily doing a great job of preventing chances and shots against when he was on the ice. Now, this isn't entirely on Nico Sturm. His line mates certainly didn't do him any favors, in particular when he was playing with a player like Nick Bonino, as well as his defensemen, as he was not usually on the ice with Erik Karlsson, as Erik Karlsson would be reserved for maybe the players who were slightly more likely to score off of Erik Karlsson's chances. And when you look past Karlsson, the other 5 defensemen aren't necessarily known for being able to make that first pass out of the zone. So it's a bit of an awkward spot for Nico Sturm. His possession numbers aren't going to look all that great, but in the end, it was still a decent defensive season for him, even if at times, like I've mentioned earlier, he did struggle with his more expanded role for the first time in his career. And then when it comes to his time on ice, 14 minutes and 44 seconds, based to other consistent players for the San Jose Sharks, as in players who played more than a good quarter of this season, he's right around where you would expect a third liner to be. He's certainly not in that top 6 like Couture or Barabanov or Meyer or Hertl, but he's around 8th in terms of ice time generally for the San Jose Sharks, which, like I said, is where you would expect a third liner to be. He was also, I believe, 4th on the team in terms of shorthanded ice time. He was behind the usual suspects, I guess you could say, of Logan Couture, or around the same type of numbers as Matt Nieto and Nick Bonino, but generally he played a pretty sizable role in terms of that shorthanded play, and considering the Sharks did end up having a solid penalty kill, even though it was slightly worse than in years past, Nico Sturm was a decent part of that. And so when it comes to his grade, obviously there was no last season's grade. I didn't watch him play much at all with the Avalanche or with the Minnesota Wild, but this year, considering my expectations for him were to be like a okay fourth liner, and he ends up being a very good fourth liner and a solid, decently solid third liner, I give him the grade of a B. Class dismissed.